The moral of the story. Well, over the next 4 weeks, as we've heard today, we're going to focus our attention on some fascinating stories. From the beginning of time, humans have sat around the campfire and have told each other stories. Stories that have become legends, and legends that have shaped the way that we are even today. I love a good story that is told well. In fact, I think most of us enjoy and are fascinated by a great movie. We can sit there in the theatre for 2 hours, 4 times the length of a talk in church, and we barely change our position on the seat. Time passes in just a moment, and all too soon the story has come to an end. Well, 2 weeks ago, Leanne and I got tickets to Downton Abbey on the release night. And a couple of years ago, Leanne was watching the TV series, and she kept asking me to come and watch it with her. I'm not watching that silly story, I said. But one evening, while she was watching, I came in to get a drink of water or something, and I stood there for 5 minutes or so. And then suddenly I was sitting down on the seat, and next thing you knew it, I'd watched the rest of the story. And she was kind enough to fill me in on what had happened beforehand. You know, you've got to follow a story, don't you? Otherwise you miss out the important details. And I watched the rest of that series with her, and then I think sometime later the following 2 series as well. No life story can be a silly story, can it? It is reality. It is life. And life is amazing. And stories teach us about life, both what to do and what not to do. Perhaps that's the reason that God didn't just hand us down an instruction manual on golden tablets, but rather God inspired people to write great stories. And the Bible is just a collection of incredible stories, right from the beginning and all the way through. And from those stories, we would learn to apply wisdom and to learn from the experiences that other people have had. When Jesus began to speak publicly to the crowds, the Bible tells us in Mark 4:34 that Jesus would not speak to the people except by telling them a story. Parables being stories, either true stories or true-to-life kind of stories. Jesus observed what happened around him, and he'd mastered the art of telling a great story from everyday life, just as it really is. It engendered emotion, and it resulted in wisdom. We're going to look at 4 parables that Jesus told over the next few weeks. And our first one for today is a story that's in the Gospel of Matthew, and it's found in chapter 20. I'd like to invite you to follow along with the story as we have it here on the screen. It says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like the landowner who went out early one morning to hire workers for his vineyard." These are really practical stories of life from the time. It says he agreed to pay the normal daily wage, and he sent them out to work. At 9 o'clock in the morning, he was passing through the marketplace, and he saw some people standing around doing nothing. And so he hired them too, telling them that he would pay them whatever was right at the end of the day. And so they went to work in his vineyard. At noon, and again at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he did the same thing. At 5 o'clock that afternoon, he was in town again, and he saw some more people standing around. He asked them, "Why haven't you been working today?" And they replied, "Because no one hired us." The landowner said to them, "Then go out and join the others who are working in the vineyard too." That evening he told the foreman to call the workers in and to pay them, beginning with the ones that he had hired last. When those hired at 5 o'clock were paid, each of them received a full day's wage. And when those hired first came to get their pay, they assumed that they were going to receive more. But they too were paid a day's wage. When they received their pay, they protested to the owner, "These people only worked for 1 hour, and yet you've paid them just as much as you paid us, who have worked all day in the scorching heat of the sun." He answered one of them, "Friend, I haven't been unfair. Didn't you agree to work all day for the usual wage? Take your money and go. I wanted to pay this last worker the same as you. Is it against the law for me to do what I want to do with my own money? Should you be jealous because I am kind to others? So then, those who are last now will be first then, and those who are first will be last." I want us to think a little about the context of this story. I think that the listeners may have grown up in a worldview that is very similar to our own. And in fact, this worldview, or what I'm going to call today the law of reciprocation, has in fact been lived out since the beginning of time. It basically says that when someone does something nice to you, you'll have this deep-rooted psychological urge to do something nice in return. It's considered by many to be one of the most powerful forces in nature. As a matter of fact, we may even reciprocate with a gesture far more generous than what the original deed that was done to us. This reciprocation now forms the basis of a lot of human sociality, and professionals even apply it as a persuasive marketing and advertising tool. The study of social behavior. In the study of social behavior, reciprocation is a social norm of responding by positive action with another positive action. In social interactions, reciprocation means that in response to friendly actions, people are much more likely to be much nicer and much more cooperative than they might otherwise have been. Conversely, in response to hostile actions, they are often much nastier. So what does this look like? Well, if I go out to lunch with you and pay for both of us, you almost always will say, "Next time it will be on me." Unless, of course, you're Dad, and the kids don't seem to mind at all. Then there's an emotional reciprocation where our words make other people feel good. Whenever we say something that causes people to feel better about themselves, they have a deep, unconscious response to reciprocate in the same way. Another example is that when we do something physical for someone, like we help them move or we lend them a car, they often want to pay us back by reciprocating in the same way. We have a deep psychological need to be even with each other. If a person does something for us, we feel a need to do something nice in return. The reverse is true. If we do something that hurts other people, they feel a great need to hurt us back. And so we use the same thing with our children, and this is how it tends to continue on. You get a sticker on your chart when you put your toys away. And when you have 20 stickers, you get maybe a chocolate bar or whatever it might be. And of course, it's used in schools, it's used in university and in our workplaces. In our kingdom on earth, the law of reciprocation has become commonplace. It's normal. But was it supposed to be that way? So we read this incredible little story that Jesus tells. And on face value, we tend to react exactly the same way as the people in that story did. We say, that's not... We saw it so well here this morning, didn't we? It's not fair. Closely linked to this law of reciprocation is this word fair. We often push the fairness button. We tend to use it over and over again, and we do so from a very, very young age. If you're a parent, you've heard it many times. That's not fair. I know you've seen it when you've tried to cut slices of birthday cake into perfectly even slices. Or when you navigate who gets to sit in the front seat with mum or dad. Or who goes to bed and at what time. It's not fair that they got to play with it longer than I did. It's not fair that their teacher is better at explaining chemistry than my teacher can. It's not fair that they didn't pay their share. It's not fair. It's too difficult. It's not fair that I can't. It's not fair that university costs so much. It's not fair that they got all the good-looking genes. It's not fair the amount of tax I have to pay. It's just not fair. Well, I'm not sure if you've worked it out yet or not. You may well have, depending on your age, but sadly, life is just not fair. And often we get stuck in this comparison trap and we focus on our lack and we sit in this very unhelpful place where life is just not fair. Someone shared with me recently that she heard a podcast not long ago by Andy Stanley who said, "We don't want fair, we want more." We don't want what someone else has. What we actually want is more than they've got because we spend too much time sitting in this dark and scary world of comparison. And we can't look at the story through the lens of fairness or comparison because that isn't the right lens. The lens we need to look at it through is the one of generosity. Imagine if these workers just did what they felt called to do and they didn't worry about all the other workers around them. They would have experienced a lot more contentment, wouldn't they? If we only get what we earn, then we only get what we deserve. If we don't put in the time and work, then we don't deserve to receive the reward. This is the popular thinking in our society. And to some extent, this is the way that our whole economy works. It's based on this as well, but we run into problems when we try to apply this same paradigm of life to our relationship with God, because it turns generosity and love into a commodity that must be earned. Of course, this is totally rejected by Jesus, and he condemns that idea in the stories that he tells us. His kingdom doesn't look like this at all. He has flipped it completely around. His kingdom of love and generosity are freely and extravagantly given to every single one of us. If we're really honest, we have to admit that our sense of fairness is very egocentric. We tend to evaluate issues of fairness in terms of what I feel is fair or what is fair for me. This is a quote, we tend to measure fairness in terms of our own wants, needs, expectations, hopes, often with little or at least secondary regard for the wants and the needs of others. Often our politics are focused on what works best for me rather than thinking about what works best for our community and for our society. And yet there is another issue that this story raises, and that is the one of envy. The green-eyed monster. It blinds us, it burdens us, enrages, divides, and separates us from each other and from God. Envy leads to resentment and bitterness that can sometimes last a lifetime. Envy separates us from community and from God, and it sends us off into our lonely corners of self-pity and resentment, where we create for ourselves and sometimes for those around us this experience of a living hell on earth if we're not careful with it. This parable calls us to look at how we apply our sense of fairness and how it leads to separation and continued experience of bitterness and resentment. Well, true to his word, the landowner had the men line up to receive their wages. Now, one thing that we need to keep in mind, the only men who were guaranteed a wage in the story were which ones? The ones who went out first at 8 o'clock in the morning. Nothing was said to the other workers, only, I'll give you whatever is right. Would you accept that in your negotiations with your employer? Would you work on the basis of that kind of an agreement? The landowner gives each one a full day's wage. Imagine the shock on each person's face when he receives this full day's wage which he is not expecting from the landowner. I don't think any of them expected to receive very much, and now they're given way more than they ever thought they were going to receive. This speaks of a hugely generous landowner. He knew that these men were out of work, and he decided to give them much more than they were entitled to. Jesus, of course, is telling the story about himself. He is the landowner in the story. Jesus is the generous God, but he tells it through a story what he himself is really like. Not only is God's kingdom based on generosity, so is living in it. Jesus wants to tell us what God is like, and that God isn't fair, and neither is his gospel. A sense of fairness is very much a human characteristic. God, by contrast, is extravagantly generous, illogical, loving, and kind. God continually pours out love, forgiveness, acceptance, and generosity. His love for us is not dependent on any sense of fairness. It's not dependent on who we are or what we've done. It's not dependent on our age or our status or the power that we wield. It's not dependent on the family that we're born into or the religion that we belong to. It's not dependent on how long we've served or where we serve. It's not dependent on any good thing that we have done or continue to do. It is available without fail and without exception to every single person. So the moral of the story: if God is like a generous landowner, giving out to every one of us much more than we deserve, perhaps we too would live our lives like that. Giving out of love, forgiveness, acceptance, and generosity is simply just the very best way that we can live. The moral of the story is that we would go and do thou likewise, that we would treat people generously instead of fairly. This is what it looks like in real life. A post that Leanne shared with me from Facebook just this morning, and it was written by a Christine Turrell. She writes like this, and it fits very well with our backdrop that we are sitting amongst this morning. She writes this: I work in a decent-sized local indie bookshop. It's a great job 99% of the time, and a lot of our customers are pretty neat people. Anyhow, middle of the day, this little old lady comes up. She's lovably quirky. She effuses how much she loves the store and how she wishes she could spend more time in it, but her husband is waiting in the car. Oh, I better buy him some chocolate, she says. She piles a bunch of art supplies on the counter and then stops and tells me how my hair is so beautiful. And it reminds her of the ocean. Whoosh, she says, waving her arm. Okay, I think to myself, awesomely happy, weird little old ladies are my favourite kind of customer. They're thrilled about everything, and they're comfortably bananas. I can have a good time with this one, and so we chat, and it's nice. And then this kid, who's already been up to the counter a few times to gather his school textbooks, comes up in the line behind her. This is a major university town, so we have a lot of harried students passing through. She turns around to him and out of nowhere demands that he put his textbooks on the counter. He's confused, but she explains that she's going to buy his textbooks. He goes sheetrock white. He refuses and adamantly insists that she can't do that. It's like $400 worth of textbooks. She, this tiny old woman, boldly takes them out of his hands, throws them on the counter, and turns to me with an intense stare and tells me to put them on her bill. The kid at this point is practically in tears. He's confused and shocked and grateful all at the same time. And then she turns to him and she says, "You need chocolate too." She starts grabbing handfuls of chocolates and putting them in her pile. He keeps asking her, "Why are you doing this?" She responds, "Do you like Harry Potter?" and throws a copy of the latest book on the pile too. Finally, she's done, and I ring her up for a crazy amount of money. She pays and asks me to please give the kid a few bags for his stuff. While I'm bagging up her merchandise, the kid hugs her. We're both telling her how amazing she is and what an awesome thing that she's done. She turns to both of us and says probably one of the most profound, unscripted things I've ever heard someone say. It's important to be kind. You can't know all the times that you've hurt people in tiny, significant ways. It's easy to be cruel without meaning to be. There's nothing you can do about that, but you can choose to be kind. Be kind. The kid thanks her again and leaves. I tell her again how awesome she is. She's staring out the door after him, and says to me, "My son is a homeless meth addict. I don't know what I did. I see that boy, and I see the man my son could have been if someone had chosen to be kind to him at just the right time." I've bagged up all her stuff, and at this point I'm super awkward, and I feel like I should say something, but I don't know what. And then she turns to me, and she says, "I wish I could have hair like that, but my down hair is just too curly." And she leaves. And that is the story of the best customer I ever had. Be kind to somebody today. You never know how your actions may affect others around you, so you might as well be kind to everyone. What if this was the worldview that we humans operated from? What would happen if we moved from the world of fairness and reciprocation to the world of undeserved generosity? Maybe that would be called the kingdom of heaven. So as we finish up today, I hope that we hear the moral of the story. I hope two things. Firstly, that we could treat ourselves much more kindly than we think that we deserve to treat ourselves. Don't be hard on yourself. Despite mistakes, despite people getting the wrong idea, despite making stupid decisions, treat yourself kindly and more generously than is warranted, because that's exactly the way that God sees us. And secondly, let's be more generous to other people than they are expecting us to be. We can be generous to those who even are not able to return the favour to us, not just with material things, but much more importantly in our relationships with them. Don't just treat people the way that they treat us, but treat them far, far better than they might have done to me. Even people that we don't know, that pushy aggro driver, open up a space and let them in, even though they're an embarrassment to humanity and they don't deserve it. The beauty of this unfair kind of system is that it seems to inspire and even compel others to do the same. And the ripples of generosity, they flow outward, creating a massive circle of doing so much better than just what is deserved. This indeed is the moral of the story. Can we pray? Our Lord God, you are the God who came and told us stories, amazing, wonderful, incredible stories that change our worldview. It's not about being fair, it's about being generous. And that's the kind of God that you are to us. And I just pray that we would let that wash over us today. And then as we think about that we could say, we would like to go and do the same. And as we each go from here today, I pray that we will be people not saying it's not fair, but saying, how can we be more generous? How can we be more kind than we've ever been before? May we go from here. May your Spirit be upon every person. I pray in your name.